Coming up, zombies rule in the apocalyptic 60s, but in the touchy-feely 1970s, the vampires return, and they just want to be held.
There's something about vampires that's about desire and sex. There's something beastly and manly and gentlemanly. In a lot of ways, it is that archaic woman's fantasy about a man.
In the 1960s, zombies take over, as the idea of an undead uprising resonates with Americans grappling with big social issues, from civil rights to poverty to war. But while the flesh eaters rose up, the musty old vampire took a nosedive. As the 60s end, the times are ripe for a whole new breed of vampire. Sensitive, conflicted, and tragically hip. And it all starts with the me decade.
The 60s were about fixing the world, and the 70s were about fixing yourself. People really turned inwards in the 1970s. They're joining New Age movements, they're reading self-help books, and they're going into therapy.
In the midst of the me decade, San Francisco author Anne Rice becomes introspective for a serious reason: the death of her 5-year-old daughter.
When her daughter died from leukemia, Anne Rice lost her faith. She threw herself into her writing.
She's definitely questioning, what does life mean? What's it all about? Why are we here?
In 1976, Rice publishes her first novel, later made into a film called Interview with a Vampire. It was a groundbreaking vampire story because it brought the monster into the me decade.
Nobody had ever seen anything like Interview with a Vampire. The vampire is talking to a reporter and relating his life. And that was just such an original thought.
In Bram Stoker's Dracula, we hardly hear Dracula speak at all, and we certainly never hear Dracula think.
She looks at the vampire as a character that is trying to overcome the alienation he feels on Earth. And this, echoes what she began to see as the human existence, at least in America.
Anne Rice is the start of a more sympathetic series of vampires, because you can sympathize with people so much more when you see the world from their point of view.
It's a watershed moment in horror, as Rice creates the first vampire who overshares. But these vamps aren't just conflicted about blood-sucking.
The good part about being a vampire is living forever, and the drawback about being a vampire is living forever. Your friends, your family, they pass away. You're left there lonely, going on and on and on. That is a rather sorrowful place, if you have any regrets, to think that you'll be here forever, working through those regrets.
As humans who will eventually face death at one point or another, we don't often consider what it would be like to outlast everyone else.
It is our mortality that makes us able to love in the intense way that we do, that enables us to have all the things that make us human.
While reviews are mixed, readers embrace Anne Rice's book and her me-decade vision of vampires.
It becomes a bestseller, and just with this one book, a new generation of vampire readership begins to build.
Her work is so immensely popular that other people begin to write vampire novels too. Something like 60% of all the novels ever published on vampires have been published in the last 40 years, and Anne Rice is the start of that.
While Anne Rice revitalized the genre with a touchy-feely vampire for the me generation, the 1980s bring forth a whole new market for the undead, and Generation X is a tough audience.
Generation X is growing up, they're in their teens, and marketers see money. MTV comes along and they really crack the code. They have a new vision of youth culture, and Generation X is buying it.
Hoping to tap into MTV's success, Hollywood turns the vampire genre on its head. By mixing Dracula with Peter Pan, they create the first teenage vampire.
In 1987, The Lost Boys arrives. It's the perfect movie for the MTV generation with the best tagline possible. Sleep all day, party all night, never get old, never die.
The Lost Boys is about a family that moves to a new community and realizes that all is not well in their new suburban paradise. There's a group of roaming high school bad boys who at night turn into vampires.
It speaks to our teenagers and our desire to be eternally young. We're starting to see the generation that doesn't want to grow up.
It's a revolutionary new concept in vampire flicks, where eternal youth meets youth culture, and Lost Boys is a huge hit.
With The Lost Boys, we really start to explore more the eternal youth aspect of the vampire.
I can't remember a young vampire in literature or in film until the late 20th century.
It's really just a great teen movie that just also happens to have some great scares and vampires and some bad mullets.
But while teenage boys find their undead anti-heroes in The Lost Boys, the girls aren't invited to the party. And as we enter the 90s, young women are looking for a way to take out their frustrations.
In the 90s, there was a resurgence of girl power.
In the 90s, I think on a surface, young women have moved into a post-feminist era where they have the expectation that things are going to be equal for them. At some point in high school, in college, in the working world, they run up against the fact that that's not true.
The 1990s are a really frustrating time for young women, and you really hear that in the music of the Riot Girl bands. Young women are angry.
Sounds like someone needs a monster to slay. Enter third-generation TV writer Joss Whedon. While working as a Hollywood script doctor, he shops around his pet project, a hip gothic movie with an unlikely heroine named Buffy the Vampire Slayer. After a 1992 film proves to be a false start, Whedon gets a second shot 5 years later with a fledgling TV network called the WB. With Buffy, Whedon takes the traditional horror movie trope and turns it upside down.
Buffy was originally based on the blonde girl who gets killed near the beginning of all the horror movies, the one who just happens to be walking down the wrong alley at the wrong time. And what Joss Whedon said was, what if that girl turned around and just kicked the vampire's ass?
Buffy is about girl power. She is an ordinary high school cheerleader who ends up kicking butt, slaying vampires, taking names. She empowers other girls to fight vampires.
The vampire mythology has always been about men, that women have always been the victims. You go back to Nosferatu, you go back to Dracula, you feed off the women because that's what women are there for.
Buffy was female empowerment incarnate. It was teen angst, but teen angst with very intense issues. It was something that any teenager could rally around.
By putting Buffy's high school on a portal to hell, Whedon takes typical teenage problems and turns them into literal demons.
She struggles with the same things that everyone her age struggles with. She's just got these extra burdens added on top of it.
In Buffy, teenagers have the power to conquer their own demons. She is the one who has the power to save the world, and she does. A lot.
The show becomes a critical favorite, draws a rabid fan base, and it doesn't just change our attitude towards vampires, it transforms the role of women on TV and in movies.
The Buffy series paved the way for strong heroines.
Without Buffy, we wouldn't have Veronica Mars. We wouldn't have the strong women in Battlestar Galactica. We wouldn't have the Hunger Games.
It was a hit show, even though it was on sort of a minor network. But the shadow that it cast going forward was really long.
But as we know, vampires don't cast shadows.
Just as the 1990s vanished in the blink of an eye, so did the Buffy era. And now we have sparkly vampires.
Buffy might have electrified a whole generation of young women by turning the undead into dead meat, but a new vampire is about to change everything, because he isn't a monster, he's a pinup.
In our generation, we thirst for youth and to live forever. And maybe that's what the undead represent for us, foreverness and youth.
From the earliest folklore through the 20th century, vampires have evolved, growing younger, sexier, and more human, in step with a changing world. But now it's the early 21st century, an era marred by environmental disasters, economic collapse, and wars. It's gonna take a pretty nasty monster to scare us in these frightening times, right? Well, not exactly. Today's biggest vampire is young, he's chaste, and occasionally, he sparkles.